Hello and welcome to today's technique tutorial. My name is Samantha Wiltshire and today I'm going to be walking you through some shading skills and we're going to be learning how to apply some nice smooth rendering to a really simple three-dimensional object today. You can see that here on the introductory slide, I've included an example. This is an artwork that I produced a few years ago, where you can see that I've applied that smooth rendering to the fabric on the shirt and also to the face. So these are really important foundational skills, which are going to be applicable to majority of the drawings that you produce, unless you're doing something a little bit more experimental. And most importantly, these skills help us to really understand how to create the illusion of three dimension. So to get started today, let's talk about our materials for this exercise and some work health and safety. What you'll need for today are a variety of pencils. You can have a go with as many as you'd like. Today I have an HB, which we're going to use for light construction, and an 8B, which is nice and dark and soft for that rendering. So these are the two I would recommend. Regardless of what type you have, you definitely want a lighter one and one which is going to be very heavy, soft and dark. You could also have an experiment today with some charcoal if you were feeling brave. I'd recommend if you're a beginner to start with pencil first and then to eventually have a go at these same activities using charcoal. Charcoal can be a little bit more challenging, in particular if you're still trying to grapple with the balance between the light and the dark, because it can very easily taint your light areas. And also sometimes as you're smudging, you can lift off the pigment and find it hard to build. So just kind of easing yourself into that, starting lighter if you're using charcoal today, and gradually building darker as you go in layers. Also, if you're using charcoal, please don't blow charcoal dust in your studio space. Be aware that people with respiratory issues might not appreciate those particles in the air. And if you're using charcoal or pencil, as a matter of fact, you can use some subfixative. This is workable fixative. It's a setting spray for your drawings that prevents them from being damaged. It's definitely a good idea to set this and to keep it so that you can refer back to it as a learning tool later down the track in your artistic practice. I also have today my blending tools. I have some paper stumps. Any sort of paper stump or smudge stick would be great to experiment with today. And for larger areas, I also really like to use just plain tissue. You know, paper stumps have a nice sharp point. We can use them on their point or on their side, which is fantastic. But sometimes if it's a very large drawing with a big area, that's very labor intensive. So I just want to be able to get in there with the tissue and to not have that problem. I also have a ruler with me today. You might choose to use a ruler, but it is optional. I'm going to be showing you how to use that as a bit of a makeshift mole stick, but you can certainly use professional mole sticks as well. You'll also need something with a circular base. So I just have a paperweight here that I have traced around. For this exercise, because these are beginner level skills, you're not going to be required to know how to draw a perfect freehand circle. If you can, that's fantastic. But otherwise, for some of you, you might not be there quite yet. And so tracing is absolutely fine for today. You will also want a reference. So I have here a nice foam sphere that I can use to draw from life. I can adjust my lighting and make sure that it's a cast shadow. That's really beautiful. That's a little bit more tricky and it's a little bit tough to contend with changing lighting conditions. So for absolute beginners, I would recommend that you might prefer instead to use a diagram from a book. Here I have an example. This is Secrets to Drawing Realistic Faces by Carrie Stewart Parks. It's a really nice one. And over here on page 71, she's done a very similar activity to what we're going to be doing today. But you can also use the image of my finished product, which is featured in these slides. So you could print these off. You could follow through the activities. There's templates on the slide where you can do these activities yourself and it will have a reference in there for you. And that covers all of our materials today. What we're going to be doing once we've kind of set up our space and made ourselves organized is we're going to be creating a tonal scale. Then we'll be using directional lines to build tone. We're also going to be experimenting with different smudging techniques. We'll be learning to shadow shape and construct today. Again, not complex construction, just a trace today. Complex construction might come in a video in the future. Then we'll be working on applying and blending our tone and finishing up by cleaning our edges and adding highlights where necessary. So our lesson objectives today are to create smooth, even and controlled rendering effects on a simple drawn object. We want our object to feel lifelike and realistic. We're hoping to depict smooth textures on objects. Again, if we were creating something fluffy or bristly, we might use something a little bit more similar to impressionism even. We might be flicking or doing something expressive. We might be using directional lines in terms of hatching or cross-hatching. There's many ways we can create a variety of textures. Today, we're just thinking about smooth textures. And I'm also hoping that everyone today will improve their overall understanding of how tone, blending, and erasure work together to produce a finished drawing. The first thing we need to understand is tone in general. You also might hear tone be described as value. So when we're talking about tone or value, we're talking about everything from black, being the absence of light, through to white, representing our light when we're drawing. And then in between, we have a whole variety of grays, which we call midtones. And so you can see that there's a scale provided for you here, and I'm going to show you in just a minute how to fill that out. So when we control our tone by either building our pigment or slowly in layers, or by understanding the pressure that we can place on our material to change our tone, it really impacts our outcomes. It creates much better outcomes when we understand that process. So let's grab our darker pencil. I've got my 8B pencil here, and I'm going to just flick over now. Your worksheet that you've been given with summary notes will also have areas for you to complete each of these activities as we go. The first thing I want to understand about tonal work is that I have a full range of tones from black through to white. Black being the absence of light, and white being light when we're trying to draw. And in between, I have a whole variety of what we call midtones. So a whole bunch of different types of grey that help me transition in between the two. And what I would recommend you do to begin with when you're starting out is you actually should have a go at producing one of these. Make your own tonal scale. This is really helpful because it teaches you that the amount of pressure that you place on your material is going to directly impact the heaviness of your shadow. So we really want to understand our materials. We really want to have that control. So you're going to press really, really darkly or heavily, to create a nice dark shadow. And you're going to gradually release the pressure. So gradually becoming lighter and lighter and lighter until you reach almost white. And you can do this with any material when you first are familiarizing yourself with it, so that you understand its full capacity and you understand yourself and applying pressure. So we can build up tone either in this format by applying pressure, or you can actually build things up more gradually, and you can have a little bit of a practice of that too. So see what happens when you go over and over and over the same spot with a mid-tone. See how long it takes you to try and build it up to be very, very, very dark. Those are our main two methods of applying tone. So that's the first thing to understand, is about pressure and about our full scale. The next thing to understand about tone is that the direction in which you shade impacts the shape that you produce. So here I have a really basic cube in perspective, and I have a really, really basic cylinder. So we want to draw with the facets or the planes of the shape, so with each surface. So if this is a flat square, I'm going to do horizontal lines. So I'm shading by building up horizontal lines. I'm going to decide that this is my darkest face. You might need to break the rules a little bit in the corners to get a better final result. But for the most part, try and remain horizontal as much as you possibly can. Then what I'm going to do is on the side, I can see that it goes in a diagonal direction. So I'm actually going to use diagonal lines. And I'm going to make this side a little bit lighter. There I go, I can put that in. I can now see also that this should be a little bit darker if I really want to create a sense of 3-dimension. Now I have a nice square in perspective, and doing the lines in the direction of the shape really helps me to describe how it turns in space. And the cylinder is also a fantastic example of this. So I'm going to actually use curved lines where the shadow is. And that's going to help me to build up my shadow and to describe how that particular shape behaves. That's really important for us if we're rendering a sphere, of course, because our sphere itself is also round. So I'm not going to complete this one, but you can in your own time really carefully finish that off and see if you can create a cylinder that feels nice and 3-dimensional. So we've talked about pressure, we've talked about direction. The next thing we need to understand, especially if we're going for a very smooth sort of tonal work, is that the way that we choose to smudge has a tremendous impact. So what I'm going to do is in each of these boxes, I'm just going to fill in any random mid-tone very quickly. It doesn't have to be neat. In each box. And now I'm going to have a bit of an experiment at smudging in different ways. So the first box, I'm going to use my pointer finger for. Now, I don't love to use my pointer finger when I smudge. I find that it's a little bit rough. I find that I lack control a little bit when I use my pointer finger. But the only way to discover this for yourself is through experimentation. So there's my pointer finger. Now I'm going to try my ring finger. Now, if I'm smudging with my fingers, which isn't very often because it's not my personal preference, I really prefer to use my ring finger because I find that it's very gentle. And I just find that for me personally, I tend to get a nicer finish. There we go. That's my ring finger attempt. Now let me see what happens when I add tissue. Now there's a few reasons for doing this. The most important reason is because your fingers have oils, they have sweat, they have impurities that they've picked up from the world around you, from the things you've been touching throughout your day. And we really don't want those things to mix with our drawing. We don't want that to get stuck in the grains of our paper or in our pigment or graphite, whatever it is we're working with, because we'll make lots of horrible little smudges everywhere that are then really irritating for us to try and remove with an eraser. So this is a great way to avoid that problem altogether. So here I go. I can really press into it. I'm not being shy. I want to create a lovely blurred airbrush finish. So to me personally, I love the transitions that I get with the tissue much better than I love what I produce with my fingers. And in the last box, I'm going to try with my smudge stick. My smudge stick, because it has a nice sharp point and a flat side for me to use, I have a lot of control with this tool. I have the ability to do some really fun things. So this is my personal favorite. You might also see some people use a smudge stick that looks pretty much like a white pencil. And those can be really helpful too. You'll even see some people, perhaps if they're actually smudging with, not smudging, my apologies, if they're actually using colored pencil itself, lots of different colors, they will actually use their white pencil to smudge as well. That is something which is really useful for a lot of people. And you might also find that using the pencil version rather than a paper stump is your personal preference. So now I've had a play. Usually you'll find that you have a preference out of these different types of smudging. So you'll need to work out for yourself in your practice what you prefer to use. And now we can start to apply these various skills to our actual circle that we've created up here. So I have here my paperweight. I've traced around it, and you can do the same. Now what I'm going to do is just pop a shadow underneath it here, because we want to ground it on its surface. We don't want a floating ghost object. We want it to feel like it has gravity and weight and like it sits down on a table. That'll help us with our realism. You can see that I've created a little example here. These are 2 plums. And what you'll notice about these 2 plums is that I have not only drawn their basic shape when I've constructed my drawing, but I've also drawn the shapes of the shadows themselves. A lot of people call this shadow shaping. Basically, I've made myself a color by number. So you can approach your drawing in this way too, if you'd like. The benefits of doing this are that now I've focused on the shape of the shadow and I know it's correct. I don't have to worry about it when I'm actually applying my tone. I can just focus on making sure the value, how dark or how light it is correct, and whether or not it needs to be a soft edge or a sharp, crisp edge, how blurred it ought to be. I can just focus on those factors without worrying about this when I do this in advance. So what we're going to do now is that exact same process, but for this sphere. So I'm going to grab myself my HB pencil. One of the very first things I'm going to do is mark where my light is coming from. So for me, my light is coming from somewhere over here in this direction. So I'm going to put a circle where I can see that I have my lightest light up over here. Now, my object is also sitting on a white surface. And so that white surface is reflecting light onto the bottom of my object. So I'm going to map in that reflective light down here. I can then see, again, using my reference picture, I can see then that this is the darkest dark, then we have a medium tone before it reaches the light. Now, the best way to do this from life, or if you're using an image, is to squint your eyes. You want them to be blurred on purpose. It stops you from seeing the detail, and it causes you just to focus on where those big areas of tone are, so that we can work into the details more gradually. So for me, I can see that then this is my second most dark area here. So I'm shaping that shadow. Then I've got lighter tones that gradually transition towards this white. When I'm approaching a drawing, I like to start from the darkest dark first. This is for a few reasons. The first reason is because I really want to leave my white areas untouched. I don't want them to become too dark and then difficult for me to lift with an eraser. So I'm starting dark and I'm not touching them at all until the very end, those light areas. Another reason is because the contrast, that difference between dark and light, is what helps things feel three-dimensional and real. As artists, we're relationship experts, and if the relationship between the darkest dark and the lightest light, if it isn't correct, you're not going to achieve a sense of three-dimension. It's not going to look realistic. Even if I wanted to draw the shadows, even if I wanted to produce shading that was lighter than real life, even if everything was lighter, I would still have to have the same difference between dark and light, or at least similar. The difference would have to be the same, even if everything was lighter, in order for me to achieve that three-dimensional shape. So starting with the darkest dark, I can see this shadow underneath is the darkest. And that's often the case, because if you think about it, that's that tiny little nook where your object hits the table. There's not going to be any light reaching there underneath there at all. And like we talked about down here, I'm trying my best to produce lines as I shade, which are in the general direction of this kind of elliptical shape of this shadow down here. And I'm not putting myself under too much pressure. This does not have to be perfect because I can clean it up with my smudging tools. I can build it up further with my pencil, and I can erase if I have to. Although this dark will be quite difficult to erase. So that is why it's better if you can help it to do the shadow shaping first. Some people like to jump straight into tone. I do like to give myself a guide to avoid kind of doing things to my drawing that are then difficult for me to take back with an eraser. So there's my dark shadow underneath. Now I'm squinting and I'm asking myself, well, where is the next darkest dark? For me, that's right here. So I'm going to skip over my reflective light. And I am going to start to fill in this dark area in here. Now, if I'm not quite sure, I can go a little bit lighter and build more gradually. But once I have my confidence, I really want to make sure that this is as dark as it needs to be. Again, otherwise the relationships won't be correct, and I'm potentially compromising my sense of realism. So you might find yourself doing a little bit of scribble or circling like I'm doing here in some areas just to fill in your white spaces and get rid of them. And that's completely okay, especially if you're going to be buffing them out using one of these techniques later. Now what I'm going to be doing is gradually releasing the pressure like we practiced up here. Now this, again, does not have to be perfect. I'm trying my best to do lines which are in the correct direction. But at the end of the day, I'm going to be smudging anyway, and I can hide a whole variety of sins when I do that. You'll notice that even though I'm going up and down, it's a curved up and down line. It's still mimicking the shape of my object. And I'm leaving myself a little bit of what I would call a buffer zone. I'm not going all the way up into the very edge of this light area. I'm reminding myself that my pigment is going to move in this direction anyway, and I would rather underdo it than overdo it. I am noticing that my reflective light down here, though, is probably a little bit large, and so this is a great time for those sorts of corrections. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my tissue on my finger. And I'm going to buff it out. And just look how effective that is already. Look at that pigment. I might also have to press more lightly on my actual buffing tool as well. I might need to flip it to a clean side if it's looking a little bit too harsh. And as predicted, this dark area crept further into my light area than one might have suspected. So that's why that buffer zone can be so incredibly important. I also know that I don't want that reflective light to be lighter than this light up the top. So I'm going to go ahead, smudge over the top, turn that into a bit more of a mid-toned area. Now I'm going to need to do some adjusting because with that finger and tissue technique, I don't have quite as much control. So I'm taking my kneadable eraser, I'm squishing it into my desired shape. And I'm just going to go around and give it a bit of a tidy. Also around my shadow. I might also decide that I want to lift some more of my light area. So I'm dabbing my kneadable eraser. If I lift too far, or if I'm then not happy with the texture of my light area, I might come in this time with my smudge stick. And I might really focus in on that little area. Also on any little pencil strokes that I can see that aren't as smooth as I would have liked. And I could spend quite a long time if I needed to. Just really making corrections and making sure that I'm 100% happy. I might also decide that now this reflective light is not as light as I would have liked. I actually over darkened it. And so you're going to find that there's a lot of push and pull when you're really trying to make these sorts of drawings accurate. You're going to be pulling the light back into focus. You're going to be pushing it away again with your pencil. You're going to be darkening again in some of these areas if when you smudged it lifted the pigment off. And what you should hopefully be left with is a nice three-dimensional looking shape, a little bit like this, that makes you want to reach out and grab it. And this is a great first step in order to then practice further and maybe make your way towards something like these plums, where it's a spherical shape, but maybe a little bit more complex as a way of practicing these sorts of skills. Remember when you're doing this process that your edges matter. So soft edges, which feel out of focus or feel gentle, are important. And so are those really sharp, crisp areas. You want your eyes to be your own multifocal lens camera, and you want to be able to push and pull things back and forwards into focus and out of focus. And you want to get that realism. If you're not focusing on your edges, you will find that you won't achieve that realistic result. So here I have some of our image references today. We also have drawings by myself throughout this slide. And let's talk to finish up about what you should do next once you finish this. How can you now build on these skills? First of all, practice makes perfect. So choose something which is really similar in shape, but a little bit more challenging, like round fruits, like the plums that I had done some shadow shaping for down here. They're a really great example. They'll be challenging enough in terms of their tone, but hopefully should be appropriate for this level if you're still working on constructing some basic shapes. You should also draw something smoothly and rendered smoothly in isolation, and then try and apply this technique to a full composition. So rather than just a single object, have a go at doing this to a variety of objects in a still life. You can also be practicing your control by drawing something lighter overall and then something darker overall. So the thing about tone is that it doesn't matter whether you want to create an image which is lighter than reality or darker than reality, you still have to have the relationships correct. When you start out, I would aim just for accuracy, just for exactly what you can see. And I would aim for the darks and the lights to be lifelike. Once you get a little bit more skilled in your technique, you should be able to deliberately make everything lighter or everything darker. And the way to still do that without losing your sense of three-dimension is to make sure that the difference between your darkest shade and your lightest shade is still enough, even if your darkest shade is lighter than life or darker than life. So you can practice kind of changing the level of dark or light. And also once you've mastered smooth rendering, you'll be able to experiment with other existing techniques such as hatching and cross-hatching, but also maybe exciting and unique new ways of applying shadow. Our basic understanding of tone that we've covered today is the foundation for all of this. But there's so many possibilities, so many ways that you could create texture and tone for yourself. So have a go, do something creative and show your tutor when you're finished. And what we can work towards is eventually being able to do this with colour. So here we have Pink Fluffy Peony by CJ Hendry, who's an Australian artist, and she loves to work in coloured pencil. And that would be a great long-term goal to have, to be able to do this with colour mediums as well, once you have a fundamental understanding of colour theory to add to the skills that we built today. Thank you so much for your time. Happy art making.